On the ancient battlefields of Greece, when the dust finally began to settle and the screams of the dying faded into a hollow wind, most armies treated the end of combat as a brief, fragile truce between life and death, a moment to collapse, to cry, to call for physicians and pray that herbs, bandages, and time would do their work. But for the Spartans, there was no such luxury, because war did not wait for wounds to close, and a warrior who needed rest to stand again was already considered half lost. To them, healing was not a gentle process guided by careful hands and soft words, but another form of battle, and the enemy was not the spear that had pierced the flesh or the blade that had torn the skin. The enemy was weakness itself. When a Spartan was cut open, the first reaction was not panic, not shock, not even anger. His first thought was whether he could still hold his shield, still grip his spear, still stand in the line without breaking it. If the answer was yes, then the wound was not a reason to stop. It was simply new information that his body had to manage. If the answer was no, then the question became even harsher. What must be done, right now, to make that answer change? Far from the polished marble of temples and the ordered silence of healing halls, Spartan warriors often had to treat their own injuries on the field or in rough camps that smelled of sweat, blood, and wet earth. There were no physicians waiting with trays of tools and delicate cloth. There were brothers, calloused hands, and whatever nature offered in that moment. They used pressure, heat, dirt, cloth torn from cloaks, leather straps, and crude stitches pulled through flesh, with the same lack of hesitation with which they drove spears into enemies. One of the first rules they learned was brutally simple: bleeding must stop, and it must stop fast. If a gash opened on the arm or the thigh and blood began to flow freely, they did not wait to see how bad it was. They pressed their hands into it with all the strength they had left, feeling the warmth soak into their palms, and kept that pressure until the flesh began to close and thicken. If they had a strip of leather or cloth, they tied it tight, not caring about the pain, because pain meant life. They believed that a warrior who complained about the sting of a bandage did not deserve the honor of one, but stopping blood was only the beginning. Spartans also knew, not from books, but from generations of hard experience, that the land around them carried plants whose leaves and roots could change the way the body felt pain, fight infection, or at least keep a man on his feet long enough to finish what he had been born to do. They did not speak of these plants with mystical reverence, as if they were gifts from gentle gods. They treated them like weapons that grew from the soil, tools to be used without hesitation. So it was not rare, after battle or during a brief pause between marches, to see a wounded Spartan sitting on a rock, his skin torn and bruised, while another warrior crushed bitter leaves between his fingers, mixing them with saliva, earth, or a splash of sour wine, creating a paste that smelled harsh and wild. They would smear that mixture directly onto the wound, feeling it sting like fire before the numbness began to spread. A strange cold that crawled across the skin and sank into the flesh beneath. Sometimes the remedy was not meant to be applied on the outside at all. There were plants so bitter that most men would spit them out before even swallowing, leaves that tasted like poison and roots that scratched the throat like gravel. Yet the Spartans chewed them calmly, slowly grinding them between their teeth, letting the juices spread over their tongue and seep down into their bodies, because they believed that a warrior who could not handle bitterness in his mouth would never handle it in his life. Imagine that scene for a moment. A Spartan, blood on his chest, dust on his skin, the mark of a fresh cut still glistening across his side, raising a torn stalk of some harsh, wild herb to his lips and biting into it with the same calm ferocity he used against his enemies. His face twists for a heartbeat as the taste hits sharp, acidic, almost nauseating, but he does not spit it out. He clenches his jaw, swallows the bitterness, and lets it burn its way down, using its sting as a distraction from the deeper pain beneath his ribs. To an outsider, it would look insane, even barbaric. To a Spartan, it was discipline in its purest form, because in their minds, healing was never about comfort, it was about function. The question was always the same: can I still fight? Can I still march? Can I still hold the line? If a plant, however disgusting or sharp tasting, could dull the pain for a few hours, that was enough. If a paste of crushed leaves and wine reduced the swelling of a wound, they were willing to endure its sting without a word. If pressing a hot piece of metal against an open cut sealed it faster, they accepted the smell of burning flesh like another kind of incense rising to the gods. They also believed deeply in the power of movement itself as a form of healing. A wounded limb that did not move would grow stiff, and stiffness, to them, was a promise of future weakness. So even with fresh injuries, Spartans would walk, stretch, flex, and test their range of motion. If a leg was cut, they marched on it. If an arm was sliced, they lifted their shield regardless. The body, they thought, must be reminded constantly that it still belonged to the warrior, not to the wound. Rest, in their philosophy, was something earned only by the dead. The living were expected to keep moving. This attitude shocked other Greeks, who saw rest as essential to recovery and who called for physicians whenever the smallest injury occurred. But Sparta did not raise men to return to comfort, it raised them to return to the line. There was no waiting for perfect healing, because there was no such thing in their world. Scars layered over scars, forming a rough map of every battle, every training session, every fall, and every near-death they had survived. A smooth body was an accusation, a marked body was proof. The mothers of Sparta reinforced this brutal approach long before their sons ever saw battle. When a boy came home crying from a fall, from a bruise, from a scraped knee, he did not receive the tender sympathy that children elsewhere might enjoy. He received a cold hand on his shoulder and words that cut deeper than any wound. "You are not broken. Stand up." That phrase became a kind of medicine of its own, one that seeped into his mind and stitched together not flesh, but resolve. By the time those boys became warriors, they no longer asked if something hurt, they asked if it mattered. And so, when the day came that a spear finally found its way past shield and armor and left a deep, burning line across a Spartan side, his reaction was not that of a man surprised by pain, but of someone who had been rehearsing this moment his entire life. He pressed his hand to it, felt the warmth, measured the depth, and if his lungs still filled with air and his legs still obeyed, he remained where he stood. Only later, once the field was quiet, would he sit by the fire, tear a piece of cloak, press plant paste into the wound, and perhaps bite down on a bitter stalk to keep his jaw from tightening when the sting grew too sharp. He did not wait for a healer to arrive. He was his own healer, and for the Spartans, that was the only kind that mattered. While most armies relied on physicians trained in temples and apprentices who carried baskets of tools and linens, the Spartans believed that a warrior should know how to keep himself alive with nothing but his hands, his brothers, and whatever the land offered. This belief created a form of battlefield medicine so harsh, so direct, and so fearless that even their allies were shocked by how casually Spartans treated wounds that would send others into panic. It was not that they considered injuries meaningless, but that they considered weakness unacceptable, and the only cure for weakness was will. One of the most infamous techniques the Spartans used was cauterization, the brutal practice of sealing a wound with fire. When bleeding refused to stop, or when a deep cut exposed raw flesh that throbbed with each heartbeat, a group of Spartans would heat a piece of metal in the coals of a fire until it glowed a deep, dangerous orange, and without ceremony or hesitation, they pressed it directly against the wound. The smell of burning flesh rose in thick curls of smoke. The skin sizzled like meat on a pan, and the warrior bit down on leather, on a vine, or even on a bitter plant root to keep from clenching too violently as the pain surged through him. To outsiders, this was torture. To a Spartan, this was discipline. The fire stopped infection, sealed the cut, numbed the nerves through sheer shock, and allowed the warrior to continue marching. The process required no equipment, no knowledge of anatomy, only courage. And courage was the one resource Spartans never lacked. But cauterization was merely one tool among many. When a wound needed to be closed more delicately, Spartans resorted to stitching rough, primitive, and painful stitching done with bone needles carved during training, sharpened with stone, and threaded with fibers pulled from cloak fabric, animal sinew, or strips of plant matter. They washed nothing, sterilized nothing, and paused for nothing. The needle pierced flesh with a directness that felt almost violent, pulling the skin together with a force that made the surrounding muscles twitch and the jaw tighten involuntarily. Yet the warrior did not flinch, because flinching was a sign of hesitation, and hesitation had no place in a Spartan life. It was common during these crude surgeries for the injured man to sit perfectly still, breathing slowly through his nose, staring ahead with unfocused eyes, while another warrior, often a friend or battle companion, worked quickly and without apology. There were no soothing words, no promises that the pain would be brief. There was only silence, the rhythmic pull of thread, and the unspoken understanding that this was simply another test, one more trial in a life built from trials. And if no needle was available, Spartans turned to something even more primal, pressure and binding. They wrapped torn leather or strips of cloth tightly around the wound, tying knots with so much force that the blood flow diminished and the swelling reduced. Sometimes they soaked the cloth in wine, believing correctly, in part, that its acidity could slow infection, though they used it not with scientific precision, but with the instinct of men who had learned through centuries of war what worked and what didn't. Wine stung brutally when it touched open flesh, but that sting was welcomed. It was proof that the fight to survive was beginning. In the absence of cloth or leather, Spartans used mud, not the soft mud of riverbanks, but the gritty mixture of dirt, ash, and crushed leaves that packed tightly and dried quickly. They plastered it directly onto wounds, allowing it to harden like a primitive cast. To modernize, this seems unsanitary, yet for minor cuts and gashes, this method created a protective layer that kept insects out, absorbed moisture, and forced the wound edges to stay immobile. Warriors marched with dried mud clinging to their skin like armor, each layer cracked and flecked with blood, but serving its purpose, keeping the injury sealed while the battle or march continued. Yet none of these methods, not fire, not stitching, not mud, not wine, compared to the Spartan belief in movement as medicine. They refused to let an injured limb remain still for too long, because stillness, to them, was the cousin of decay. If a man cut his thigh, he walked on it. If he tore the flesh of his shoulder, he lifted his shield again and swung his spear until the pain became part of the rhythm. They believed that as long as the body moved, it lived, and the moment it rested too easily, death began creeping in from the edges. During the agoge, boys practiced this philosophy so thoroughly that by adulthood it had become instinct. If one of them scraped his knee on stone, he continued running. If he bruised his ribs during wrestling, he returned to the circle and fought until the instructor dismissed him. If a thorn pierced his foot, he tore it out, smeared dirt into the hole, and kept walking. The idea was not to ignore pain, but to master it, to convert it into something manageable, to treat it as familiar rather than frightening. This mental training was the true foundation of Spartan medical practice. They understood that the mind could either amplify pain until it became unbearable or silence it until it became background noise. Through years of discipline, they learned to choose the latter. A Spartan felt pain. Of course, they were human, but they learned to categorize it: pain that mattered and pain that did not. Wounds that endangered the phalanx were serious. Wounds that only harmed their comfort were irrelevant. This distinction allowed them to heal in ways that seemed almost superhuman to their enemies. Stories spread through Greece of Spartans who fought with arrows still embedded in their bodies, who marched with deep slashes on their legs, who refused to sit even when blood ran down their sides. Some of these tales were exaggerated, but others were not. There were indeed Spartans who chose to break arrow shafts and keep fighting rather than stop to remove the embedded tip. Even infection did not terrify them as it did others. They believed that fever could be fought by sweat, so they wrapped themselves in cloaks and sat by fires, forcing their bodies into a heat that felt unbearable but often helped purge sickness. If the wound swelled and burned, they cut it open again, released the trapped fluid, and packed it with new paste from fresh plants. It was not elegant, not clean, not safe, but it worked often enough to become tradition. Above all, the most powerful force in Spartan healing was the presence of their brothers. Warriors treated one another not with the pity that breeds weakness, but with the unspoken respect that breeds strength. A Spartan did not say, "Are you hurt?" He said, "Can you stand?" He did not ask, "Does it hurt?" He asked, "Can you continue?" And if the answer was yes, even whispered through clenched teeth, then the matter was settled. Because Spartans believed one thing above all: a warrior's body belongs to Sparta, not to pain. And so they healed their wounds, not by waiting for time or medicine, but by commanding themselves to continue living as warriors, even when the body begged for rest. In the end, what truly set the Spartans apart from every other people in the ancient world was not the severity of their wounds, nor the brutality of their cures, but the philosophy that bound every gash, every broken rib, every burn, and every scar into something larger than the flesh that carried them. To the Spartans, a wound was not an interruption of life. It was confirmation of it. Not a reason to stop, but a reminder to continue. Not a sign of fragility, but a mark of purpose carved directly into the skin. Their approach to healing, crude, fearless, merciless, was only the outward expression of an inner command they carried from childhood. The body must obey the will, not the other way around. This command echoed through every Spartan camp, through every barracks of the agoge, through every battlefield where the red cloaks moved like a single river of relentless motion. It was the glue that held their phalanx together, the reason their enemies described them as creatures born from stone, and the secret behind their refusal to rest, even when their wounds bled through their armor. A Spartan did not hide his injuries. In fact, he displayed them openly, letting the scars speak for him long before he ever opened his mouth. A body covered in healed cuts and burns was a form of honor, a silent testimony of all the battles survived, all the pain endured, all the moments when surrender had been possible but rejected. The deeper the scar, the deeper the respect it earned. Warriors who bore marks across their chests and stomachs were admired far more than those who carried wounds on their backs. After all, chest wounds were earned while facing the enemy, but wounds on the back hinted at retreat, something no true Spartan would ever accept. In their world, the appearance of a warrior on the day after battle said far more than any story he could tell. A Spartan who marched to the next location with his cloak torn, his skin stitched roughly, his legs stained with dried blood, and his breathing steady was considered a symbol of everything Sparta valued: endurance, discipline, and complete devotion to survival. There were tales from ancient writers describing how even the helots, their servants, whispered in awe when they saw how calmly Spartans handled injuries that would leave other men screaming, fainting, or begging for aid. But not every wound could be healed with fire, or mud, or wine. Sometimes the cut was too deep, the spear had penetrated too far, or the infection had taken hold beneath the skin and begun its slow, cruel spread. In these moments, the true heart of Spartan healing, the philosophy that defined their entire existence, revealed itself. Instead of seeking help or praying for a miracle, the Spartan confronted the truth with a calmness that unnerved even their enemies. They believed that life and death were simply two rooms in the same house, separated only by a door that every warrior eventually had to walk through. There was no fear in this, only acceptance. When a Spartan understood that a wound would be his final companion, he did not beg for comfort or cling to life desperately. He often refused any treatment at all, choosing instead to remain upright for as long as he could, speaking to his brothers with steady breath and clear eyes, ensuring that his final moments were lived in the same discipline that shaped his entire life. Some died sitting against their shields, others lying on cloaks stained with battle, and some even died standing, refusing to fall until their legs collapsed beneath them. Their final breaths were controlled, measured, and quiet, as if even in the last moment they insisted on mastering what little of their body remained under their command. There were countless stories of Spartans dying without ever complaining about their wounds. One spoke of a warrior whose side had been torn open by a Persian blade. Yet when his comrades asked if he felt pain, he simply laughed breathlessly and answered, "It is only flesh." Another told of a soldier whose arm had been nearly severed at the shoulder. Instead of crying out, he used his remaining strength to retrieve his fallen shield and pass it to the man next to him, saying, "Hold the line for us both." Such stories spread through Greece not as myths, but as explanations, attempts to make sense of a people whose relationship with pain defied ordinary understanding. To the Spartans, a wound was not a personal tragedy, it was an opportunity to demonstrate discipline one final time. Even in death, they adhered to their creed: never give the enemy the satisfaction of seeing you break. And so, while other armies relied on temples and physicians, trusted in herbs carefully boiled in clay pots, or prayed to healing gods who might grant mercy, the Spartans relied on themselves, on the ability to endure, on the strength of their brothers, on the plants of the earth, on the fire of the camp, on the dirt beneath their feet, and on the belief that the human body was far more resilient than most men ever learned to discover. This philosophy created warriors whose wounds did not weaken them but forged them, whose scars did not mark their limits but their victories, whose healing was not measured in comfort but in continuation. When enemies saw Spartans return to battle with crude stitches stretching across their skin, with burns sealing cuts, with dried mud caked onto half-closed wounds, they believed these men must possess some secret strength unknown to the world. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. There was no secret, no magic, no divine gift, only the absolute refusal to rest. A Spartan healed because he decided to. He stood because he refused not to. He continued because stopping would have betrayed everything he was. And this inner command, this quiet, unbreakable voice that said move forward even when the body begged for relief, became the legacy that outlived the empire itself. Centuries later, long after Sparta had fallen, historians still struggled to understand how human beings could withstand so much suffering without collapsing. They searched for techniques, formulas, forgotten remedies, and lost medical practices. But the truth remained exactly where the Spartans had left it, not in scrolls, not in temples, not in the ground, but in the mind. Because the Spartans proved something profound. The strongest medicine was not what grew in the earth, but what lived in the will of the warrior. And that will, forged in childhood, hardened in battle, and proven in every scar, became the true cure that healed their wounds without rest, without physicians, and without mercy.